Hello guys, in this tutorial we will try and understand the concepts of inheritance in C++. Okay, so first let's create a parent class. I'll explain what this means as we go along, and then I want to have a class which inherits the elements of the parent class. So that class can be called the child class, and for inheritance we add a semicolon over here and we write the name of the class that we want to inherit from. Now I'll explain why we wrote down public and what that means as well. Now first let's see how inheritance works. So imagine our parent has two private variables x and y. Now these two won't be inherited. The private variables will always remain the variables of this class only and would never be available in any other class or function. So then we have some public variables. Now they are A and B. Now these variables would be inherited by this class and they would be in this class's public section. They would be in public section because this specifies them to be public. If this was private, then A and B would become private variables of the child class. You don't need to write it down over here. I'm just uh, writing it down just so that it is more understandable. Now, there is one more type of access specifier which we haven't discussed before, which is the protected access specifier. This is used just for the purpose of inheritance. Now, the protected variables are variables which will be inherited, but they aren't available to other classes. They are only available to the child class. They are pretty much like the private variables, but they are inherited as well. So if I do int I and int j, these would be accessible by this class, but they won't be accessible in the main. Now let's create an object for our child class and let's see which of the variables are accessible and which of the variables aren't. If I want to access c.x, I can't do that because x and y were private variables and I can't use them in the main. Now let's try to access a. If I try c.a, this doesn't give me an error. Oh wait, this does. That's because I set this to private. Let me set this to public. Now it doesn't give me an error anymore. Okay, now if I try to access I should get an error because even though this is part of the child class, but it can't be accessed outside the child class because this is basically a protected variable which can only be used within the class or for inheritance and not inside the main. So if I try c.I, I get an error. That's because our child class doesn't give access to the main, to this variable. Okay, now let's try out inheritance with a real example and somewhat a practical application and situations where we actually use inheritance. Imagine we have a vehicle, a main base class for vehicle, and then we have different types of vehicles. For example, a car or a bus or a motorcycle. Motorcycle. Now, all of these have some common attributes, which would become their protected variables, such as their we need to save the make of the vehicle for all the variables. Let me include the string library as well. Hash include string. Then we need to store the number of seats as well, and we store the number of tires as well. Now we have some public functions which we need in all the classes. Sorry, these should be protected as well. No, wait, sorry, public, because we need to access them in the main. So I make a function get make. They have a name as well, sorry, string name. Now I make public getter functions, which would simply return these values and would be accessible in the main because they are public and I'll be inheriting using the public access specifier. Okay, now this returns the name, sorry, string over here. Then similarly get num seats, and this would return the number of seats. Let's just work with this at the moment and we can make rest of the functions later. Now our car would be inheriting from this base class because our car is a type of vehicle and it needs all of this. So instead of declaring all of this again and again, we can simply make a base class, make the common variables protected in our base class, and then we can use that in our child classes by the concepts of inheritance. Now, vehicle. Now, all of these would have some own functions as well. For example, for a bus, I might want to store the maximum capacity, so that can be added over here. Now, even though they are inheriting from the same class, all three, they do have some common functions which are defined in the base class, and then they have some of their own functions, like our bus has the maximum capacity stored as well. Now, if I create an object of our motorcycle M, and if I try to access the get name, I can do that. Let's That's because this was public. These two functions were public and we used public inheritance. However, if I change this to private, I would no longer be able to access this. This gives me an error because all these public variables and functions over here become private members of the motorcycle. That means that they aren't accessible in the main. Now, uh, we want to make a public function over here as well, which would return the maximum capacity. Now I can simply return the maximum capacity over here. Now this function would be limited to the bus objects only and not the motorcycle object. So if I try to access the get capacity function from this class, I won't be able to. However, if I change this to bus, this doesn't give me an error. So inheritance basically simplifies things a lot for us. It might be confusing at first, but then it makes everything simple and makes our code a lot more neater. And do try out some examples online, and I'll be posting some examples in the along with the assets of this course as well, so you can practice using them. And make sure that you clear up your concepts of inheritance because a lot of the future tutorials would be based on this. Now that's it for this tutorial, and thank you for watching.